ordinary human dating. It's enjoyable and it serves an important purpose. But when a human dates an artificial mate, there is no purpose, only enjoyment. And that leads to tragedy.
Let's all go to the lobby. Let's all go to the lobby.
If it's not in frame, it doesn't exist.
I am big. It's the picture that got small.
What's that noise?
Popcorn.
You making popcorn?
Uh-huh.
I only eat popcorn at the movies.
Well, I'm getting ready to watch a video.
Really? What?
Oh, just some scary movie.
Like scary movies?
Uh-huh.
Really? Worst film you ever saw? Well, my next one will be better. Hello? Hello?
You want to see it again?
Can we?
And just like the movies, we play out our last.
You are listening to the History on Film podcast. And now here are your hosts, Ross Lennon and Ryan Barr.
Hello, and welcome to another interview edition of the History on Film podcast. My name is Ross Lennon. I'm talking today with Dr. Dustin Abnet, author of The American Robot. Good afternoon, Dr. Abnet. Good morning, your time. How are you today?
I'm doing well, thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me on to talk about the book. I'm excited to be here. I always love talking about robots.
Me too. So I want to talk to you today about your book. You open your book in a way that, quite frankly, I think more academics should in the future by discussing the much beloved on this show program, Futurama. And I think, people might say, well, gosh, that doesn't sound, very history. But I think Futurama, is a brilliant, brilliant show. But I also think it does a very great job of intersecting with the point of this book. And so I'd like you to just tell us briefly a little bit about how you open the book and why.
Yes. So I opened the book with an episode of Futurama, really a scene in an episode that it's entitled "I Dated a Robot," and it's about this kind of situation where Philip Fry, who's your idiot hero of the show, finally gets his chance to date his dream girl, and that's the actress Lucy Liu. But he has to date her in robotic form, and he falls in love with her, and as she kind of mimics back to him what he's saying, she basically becomes like a reflection of himself, and he falls in love with this robot simulacra of Lucy Liu. And when he does, his friends show him this like 1950s style hygiene video called "Don't Date Robots," and it's all about this kind of like 1950s ideology about why you should not pursue pleasure, why you should work hard, why you should have heterosexual relationships, right? And because it's all about like creating children, right? It's all about sex with purpose and meaning, and relationships with meaning and purpose, right? The relationships that aren't easy because they are totally in your control, but relationships where you have to kind of actually take the other person into account. And it's this really kind of humorous look at a lot of the kind of key questions that the book is really interested in. And these questions, like if technology can simulate human affection, if it can fulfill individual desires, and above all, the book, I would say, is a book about consumer culture, then what's the point of risking rejection? What's the point of engaging with another human being if we could just get that from a robot, right? What's the point of hiring human workers if a robot can do it for you? What's the point of having an actual partner if you can get a robot to do it and they'll just do whatever you want them to do? And it really kind of raises those questions, right? About who we are, how we relate to other people, right? What is our purpose? right? That the book and robots in general have always kind of addressed. And so I found it this kind of really evocative, just short little story that captures so much of the complexity of robots as well. Because you've also got in that clip, you've got this idea that you could turn an actress into a robot, right? So and it's interesting that she's an Asian American actress there too, because Asian Americans are oftentimes, or Asian bodies are often stereotyped as robots in particular ways too. So it's got all these different kind of intersecting layers that I think is really fascinating. And just on a personal note, all right, for it, part of the reason why I chose it for the book is because that's how I did my job talk at Cal State Fullerton, and it apparently worked. So I figured it would maybe relate well to audiences. And just to kind of get to your larger point, I think we do as historians have an obligation to connect with audiences in particular ways. And when I am writing, I am almost always thinking about how do I connect this to my students? How do I connect this to other people? And Futurama, even if they haven't seen it, and students in 2024 often haven't seen this old of an episode of Futurama, even if they haven't seen it, it's something that can connect them and ground it for them in particular ways. And that's honestly what robots have done throughout. They ground these very complicated, unanswerable questions in something that is concrete and digestible for mass audiences. And you get intellectuals writing about robots, you get children's programming write about robots, right? It's something that can translate to so many different audiences in so many different ways. And that's what makes it, I think, such an evocative symbol in American cultural life.
And I think that, I mean, I was realizing I hadn't really introduced the book itself, but I think that anecdote does such a great job of laying out, the whole of the book and what it's all about as well. I don't think I could have done a better job than that. But, and I love science fiction in general because it does offer these sort of snapshots of how people are examining the present and how they're sort of extrapolating, like so much good science fiction is taking what we have now and applying it to the extreme that, like to its logical conclusion, you could say. Because the episode that you're talking about, they download Lucy Liu off of Napster because Napster was a going concern at that time. Something that I used, in its day. I don't know if I can say that or not, but I think the statute of limitations on Limp Bizkit MP3s has run out. But
I mean, no comment there. But I mean, I'd also note it, right? I mean, that idea that you can download a person's personality, which is, if I remember correctly, mathematically derived from her box office receipts or something like that.
Adjusted by box office gross, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that speaks to so much about our senses of like algorithmic identity here in 2024 in our age of like digital tracking, where we all have profiles all done through the tracking of everything we do on the internet. And so, I mean, in this kind of sense, are we just our data? That's a really important question here in 2024. And it's one that has gotten only more important since the book came out.
Now I'm thinking I'll have to have you back on to talk Tron. And, as much as I hated the second Space Jam movie, I feel like it kind of took what this episode was having as like a critique and saying like, no, wouldn't it be great if we had these properties living on forever, adjusted by box office gross? And wouldn't it be great to see Game of Thrones on Casablanca?
Yes, yeah, and all that's going to get kind of even more developed with now that there's increasingly the artificial intelligence tools to just do that.
Neato! A Marilyn Monroe bot!
Ooh, you're a real dreamboat.
Billy every teen.
Harmless fun? Let's see what happens next.
Billy, do you want to walk your dog?
No thanks, Mom. I'd rather make out with my Monroe bot.
Billy, do you want to get a paper route and earn some extra cash?
No thanks, Dad. I'd rather make out with my Monroe bot.
Billy, Do you want to come over tonight? We can make out together.
Gee, Mavis, your house is across the street. That's an awfully long way to go for making out.
Did you notice what went wrong in that scene? Ordinarily, Billy would work hard to make money with his paper route. Then he'd use the money to buy dinner for Mavis, thus earning a slim chance to perform the reproductive act. But in a world where teens can date robots, why should he bother? Why should anyone bother? Now, let's skip forward 80 years into the future. Where's Billy?
Farewell.
The next day, Billy's planet was destroyed by aliens. Have you guessed the name of Billy's planet? It was Earth. Don't date robots!
Brought to you by
Space Pope.
Digging into the book itself, you write that the American robot in culture is a cipher for America's relationship to labor, and that the robot is both a humanized machine and a mechanized human. I wonder if you could talk about the distinction between those two and how the robot was both a vision for the future and also this dehumanizing concept for workers.
Yeah, so robots are a cipher for a lot of different things. But one of the things that I do argue, and I am trained as a labor and cultural historian, so part of this is my own interests here. And the reason why I decided to write a dissertation and then ultimately this book about robots is because I noticed very, very early on in my PhD program when I was researching things like automation in the 1950s and 60s is that people were using the term robot and the character of the robot, right, in popular culture and things like that in two very distinct ways. And when I make that distinction between humanized machine and mechanized humans, what I mean by that is that Americans have really used the robot idea to refer to two very related but almost inverse narratives at the heart of modern life. And one of them is that the humanized machine is just how machinery seems to be acquiring more human characteristics. And the other, mechanized human, is like how at least some people seem to be becoming more mechanical. And so you've got the robot kind of synthesizing and combining these two very distinct narratives about our society, right? That start on the opposite side, but both end up in the same place, right? A world where there is no differences between human beings and machines, right? A world where everything is some sort of mixture of both of them. And to get into it just a little bit more, what I mean by it is like humanized machines. Here you've got robots that mimic certain elements of human identity. So it could be appearances. So that's what you get, like androids. Those are most popular in popular culture. But it could also be like intelligence or consciousness that you get with AI. Or it could even be something as simple as a robot's capacity to do certain kinds of tasks that had previously done by people. So just to give you an example of that, in the 30s, people initially used the term robot to refer to like traffic lights, pitching machines, recorded sound in motion pictures, things that none of us today would ever think about as calling a robot unless we were going for a really dated reference, but that people at the time understood as robotic because they were taking people's jobs. And so we have this kind of, right, machines that are acquiring human kind of characteristics. But at the other side of it, and this is the side that gets less focused today, although it's actually the original meaning of the term, you have the kind of machines that you have people that seem to have acquired machine characteristics that seem particularly machine-like. So, for instance, people who seem to lack emotional expression, or people who seem to lack consciousness or free will or agency. And here you have it. It's this term that's used to really dehumanize, objectify, and dismiss people as unimportant. Like today, you've got you can casually hear like dehumanizing jokes about people who are neurodiverse being robots, right? Because they don't necessarily emote in the ways that other people expect them to do, right? So it becomes a way to objectify and dehumanize other people. And just kind of wrap up this thing, to get back to the question of labor, my favorite really example of this is in the 1970s, when you have human workers, many of whom were people of color, striking the General Motors factory in Lordstown, Ohio. And they were striking largely because they objected to how GM was introducing some of the first industrial robots to the assembly line. Like, it was speeding up work, it was making it too difficult for them to perform their tasks. They didn't like the workplace conditions. And so they struck against that. And then the New York Times, their headline describing the strike is Revolt of the Robots. The machines aren't revolting, the people are. So like, it's literally kind of equating the workers with the machines that are being built ultimately to replace them. And it's that duality, right? It's simultaneously a machine and a person that makes it such an important kind of metaphor for us in American culture. And that's something that's always been there. And it's a really, really fascinating way to look at these kind of questions about identity and power that are so important in American studies and history.
So I think when most people think of a robot, and you touched on this a little bit, but they imagine something that still doesn't quite exist yet. So like Rosie from the Jetsons or R2D2, like the most sort of extreme examples. And I was really surprised to see how long these have been in the public imagination, even predating, which we'll get into later, the word robot itself. So I was wondering if you could describe some of the early forms of robots. Falcone had one of the earliest ones, I believe, that you mentioned, and then how you found them in doing your research. Because I would not have thought, I mean, it's one thing to search for the word robot and see how far back it goes, but, you go back further than that.
Yeah, so the term robot actually comes from the 1920s, and I think we'll talk about that later, a little bit later with the play. But I actually had a very similar experience to this. I mean, I went into writing this book with the assumption that it would be a book that is predominantly about the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and maybe a little bit into the early 2000s. I am a historian, so not too much, but it very quickly became clear to me that tension, that duality that the robot has always embraced, didn't come out of nowhere, right? That it had these much longer term predecessors that operated within American culture that go by a lot of different names. So like a good kind of early example of this that I think everybody would be familiar with would be like the Tin Woodsman of Oz, who's very clearly, he's a mechanized worker, right? He's a worker whose tool has been given power of its own that literally cuts him to pieces, and then he's replaced by tin. Like, he's a worker who's turned into a machine. You also have, in the same stories, you have Tick-Tock of Oz, who some people might be familiar with if they've seen the film Return to Oz or read any of the other books, but who is an actual like mechanical figure, right? So you have those kind of precedents to it. But the more important one are the automatons or automata that I had known existed. Like, I've read about them in books. I've been to like museums where you see these like very intricately carved clockwork and wood and metal creatures that you wind them up with a key and it turns a spring, and then they go through these kind of prearranged motions. And like I knew that these had existed, but I associated them mostly with Europe. They're usually these kind of things that cater to predominantly the European aristocracy, although by the 19th century it's larger audiences. And so I didn't really think they were going to be all that relevant. And then I literally just getting into digging into early colonial newspapers and early colonial accounts, in some cases literally doing what you kind of suggested there, like literally typing the word into a search engine, like what comes up, just to kind of see how it's used. And I found this kind of almost not underground, but this kind of small little culture of people viewing these automaton creatures in the United States. And in America, they weren't geared around aristocrats. They had a kind of more almost like middling, and then in some cases like working class audiences going to them. And so some of them are famous ones, like the automaton chess player, which was created in Europe in the late 18th century, comes to the United States in the 1820s, 1830s. That's a really critical one. But one of the first that I was able to find was this automaton Indian presented by a guy. We don't know his real name, but he the exhibitor of it, he called himself Signor Falcone. So he at least wants to be seen as this kind of sophisticated European exhibitor. And in 1788 in Philadelphia, he exhibits for audiences what he calls an automaton Indian. And it's supposed to be this, he's using the term automaton to suggest like this is a creature that's made out of clockwork and wood, and supposedly, at least according to the advertisement, it would answer any question the audience asked of it, but it would also, and this is the more, I think, evocative movement that it does, it also would fire an arrow into a location desired by audience members. And so, like the way this worked, he had like a circle with like 13 targets on it, numbered 1 to 13, and he'd ask the audience what number, and they'd yell out something, and then the automaton would fire an arrow into that. Almost certainly it's a fake. If Falcone had a machine that could have done that in the 18th century, he would be one of the most famous inventors of the period, but virtually no one has heard of him. So it's very clearly this kind of almost certainly a human being pretending to be an automaton who's actually doing this. But that metaphor of an audience, almost entirely, I think we can assume, of white Philadelphians, given the cost it actually took to get in there, like literally dictating where an indigenous warrior would fire its weapon, like literally becoming a metaphor for controlling where their violence is directed. That's a really, really interesting and powerful device, a way to get into the kind of racial dynamics of the early republic, because it becomes this fantasy of control. And I found figures like that, and not all of them had that kind of racist connotation to them. Others had more gender connotations. Some were small children, but it became very apparent to me that increasingly over time, the forms taken by these creatures increasingly mimicked the power relations of American society at the time, where they took the forms of women, exotic people of color, and children. Right, all people who, in the kind of the rhetoric at the time, were assumed to lack the agency that citizens possess.
Would it be fair to say that it's different forms of a paternalistic relationship between creator and created?
Yeah, and so they become these kinds of things. And then by the end of the 19th century, you have like literal toys that you can buy, automaton toys, which are often very, very, very racist, including one like that is a clockwork mockery of somebody who's clearly supposed to be Sojourner Truth, where the joke is that this is I believe, a direct quote from the end of the advertisement, like, she will not get the last word. Like, it's literally becomes a mean of objectification, dehumanization of a human being because of race and gender. And it becomes this way of talking about these much larger issues within American society. And as much as I wanted to then focus in on things like Robbie the robot and R2D2 and C3PO, I'm like, no, this is a story that actually needs to be told. And this is a central way of not just telling about technology. Becomes a central way of talking about racialized and gendered capitalism within American history. And given the robot's ability to speak to such a large audience, to speak to so many different audiences, that was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. And so I ended up writing about automatons and all these other figures as well.
And then if you have to do a follow-up where you spend more time on Battlestar Galactica, then so be it.
I will say one of the issues with writing a book that covers this amount of time period is that the stuff that I had originally really wanted to write about ended up getting pushed aside for some of this earlier stuff that I think really needed to be told. But yes, I do. I don't think I do want to at some point write about Battlestar Galactica and things like that.
And you will have a home to come and talk to about it here. And so on that topic of the automatons or the automata, something I found very interesting was the religious component during that first phase, religious component to the American robot in, I'll call it the long 1800s, about 1790 to 1910 is how you define it in the book. So how is Calvinism a component to the way people understood these early proto-robots?
So one of the most rewarding and challenging elements of writing about robots is that they intersect with so much that I had never even considered investigating. And Calvinism is one of those things. And the way that comes up is that automatons, right, in the 17th and 18th century world in Europe are incredibly popular, particularly among the elite, right? Whether they're aristocrats or philosophers. And people within the Enlightenment and the theologians who often respond to them oftentimes use automata as metaphors for human beings. Right? This is a kind of a critical period in intellectual history where people are really actively debating across elite realms of society across the Atlantic what it means to be human and the degree of free will and agency that people have. And right, what do people actually have control over? And what is, in the religious terms, what does God have control over? And so you have in the United States, you have Puritans like Cotton Mather, not exactly a Calvinist, but definitely influenced by Calvinist thinking, right? Who takes things like predestination and the inherent depravity of human beings and writes about how human beings are basically clockwork creatures devised by God. You have similar things coming from like deists in the period, right? The clockmaker universe kind of idea. Like so you have like Benjamin Franklin writing, maybe jokingly, maybe not, in one of his many personas about like, do we actually have free will? And so it engages with those kinds of issues. And the United States, right, the American Revolution takes place at a moment in this kind of debate where there's a great deal of like questioning about human nature and about free will. So a little bit early on in this period, right, clockwork metaphors tended to be fairly common, even from religious people. But by the end of the century, those are increasingly questioned. So you have like anti-Calvinist, like John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, basically saying, accusing Calvinism of being the same thing as like atheistic deism, because it embraces clockwork metaphors for human beings and doesn't leave room for human agency in the larger world. And when America is being founded, there's this massive kind of debate over these issues that is never really resolved. Like even today, like what we still have this like constant debates over that are at their core about free will, about agency. What do we have control over, and what do we not have control over? It makes the "Are you a robot?" questions that we get on websites all the time. It makes it a really
existential,
existential moment for people. But they become these kind of questions really do lie at the heart of what American society becomes, because the revolution instills in power, right, citizens who are not supposed to be, who are supposed to possess agency, right? And so it kind of by raising those kinds of questions, it makes the automaton be a character then that is drawn throughout American society on the period. So like Thomas Jefferson writes about him in the context of free will. So does Alexander Hamilton. So does a whole bunch of other people who are invested in creating the United States government are writing about these kinds of things as a proxy for figuring out what degree of agency can we expect people to have and not. And what I kind of argue is that it's in this case that the fact that automatons in the United States frequently took the form of the people who are dispossessed of power becomes so important. So like that automaton Indian, the French naturalist, the Comte de Buffon, is literally writing about how Native American men are mere automatons because they lack power over nature in themselves, right? That's the kind of larger importance of these kind of devices, is they make concrete these forms of discrimination that exist within the larger world. They become metaphors for this kind of dehumanization and the denial of people humanity and the rights that come with that.
And you write that Falcone's Indian did not degenerate into savagery, but that it grew more civilized by following the orders of its social superiors.
Yeah.
So there was this idea that by buying into sort of the sanitization of this clockwork, paternalistic relationship, that the people who were permitted to have agency in the society could construct, this new hierarchy. Instead of king down, it was ruling, economic class down.
Yeah, why? And again, this is most frequently applied to workers. Like, why deal with human workers who might rebel when you could just create a clockwork version of them? And again, that's the same thing with turning literally Sojourner Truth into a robot, right? It's a way to it's a way to ridicule and mock and dismiss not just her, but her arguments. And yeah, it starts with kind of Falcone's Indian in the United States and continues to a certain extent up to today.
You can choose a ready guide in some celestial voice. If you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. You can choose from phantom fears and kindness that can kill. I will choose a path that's clear. I will choose free will.
So in part 2 of your book, you discuss how during the period from World War I through the Great Depression into World War II, we get this political conception of the robot as the worker. And this is also when we get the term robot itself.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens to the American robot in this time period, and why is it so significant as sort of a bridge between part one and part three?
Yeah, so it's in this period that I say that a great deal of the central cultural work done by American culture on this larger concept of the robot actually occurs. And so what happens is 1921, you get the term robot, right? It comes from Karel Čapek's Rossum's Universal Robots, which is a play that debuts in New York in the early 1920s. And initially, because of the way the play is written, where the robots are biological, not mechanical creatures, and because of the context of like the Russian Revolution and the Red Scare, virtually nobody, well, let me put it, very few people interpret the robot at the time that the play is created as a symbol for technology, right? It's not a vision of technology. It's instead they see it as an allegory for what assembly line labor does to human workers, right? It's initially this allegory about the dehumanizing conditions basically on Ford's assembly line.
Yeah, because you do see with the introduction of the Ford assembly line, you have these what were initially like artisan crafters, even for, the early automobiles, as being able to build an entire car. But then Ford creates a system where no longer does every worker have to know how to make every part of the car. They just need to know to do a quarter half turn on this, rivet or bolt or whatever. And so it does reduce, these workers. It takes away their skills to be able to go to work at the next factory over. And it does turn them into, turn this next line to, so.
Yeah.
Great
yeah,
visuals for a podcast. turn this, but
yeah, I mean, it's becomes a way to talk about like alienation and the lack of purpose that modern labor gives to people. And so it's mostly applied in the early 1920s as a metaphor for people. Like it's weird, like just like the term computer originally referred to human beings, the term robot originally referred to human beings. And so the big thing that happens between the wars is the robot goes from the symbol of alienated, dehumanizing work to an icon of consumer capitalism. And that is a long, kind of drawn out process. But I kind of identify as the major turning points in that. One of them is films like Metropolis, where the film actually never refers to the robotic creature as a robot, but reviewers of it do, including guys like H.G. Wells, who complain that it's just a ripoff of Rossum's Universal Robots, right? So that's part of it. There's this kind of like cultural intellectual story where you have like people writing about robots, but you also have companies like the Westinghouse Electric Company building these robots, which are the first of them is basically cardboard surrounding a metal box. It's very rudimentary. Others of them have like rubber skin, but using those kind of devices to make robots into not workers but consumer items or factory machines, right? That could actually replace human workers. And including within that, I would say is maybe the thing that pushed me to really make the racialization of the robot a key kind of theme here is their Westinghouse in the late 20s, early 30s has a robot that is made with black rubber that they call Rastus, who's very clearly a racist caricature meant to be a slave for workers. And so what ends up happening over the 20s and 30s is that what starts as a critique of industrial capitalism, of the way that modern mass production and mass consumption depends on the destruction of workers' bodies, becomes by World War II really a symbol of the way that technology can be used to solve the problem of dehumanizing labor. And I guess what I mean by that, to just make that a little bit kind of clear, is that one of the kind of great ironies that happens over the period is that the robot as humanized machine, right? The robot as mechanized human gives way to the robot as humanized machine over the period, right? And so it literally becomes that the mechanized human, it literally becomes the humanized machine becomes the solution to the mechanized human being, i.e., we don't have to worry about work turning people into machines anymore, because in the future, we'll just invent an actual machine to replace them. That's what happens over the 20s and 30s. And after a really brief period in World War II, where robots are both Nazis and like Nazi soldiers and Nazi technologies, by the time you get to the 1950s and the mass consumer society, you have guys like Isaac Asimov, who saw a lot of the Westinghouse robots, right, embracing that kind of vision of the consumer robot in ways that lead to or inspire the development of the robotics industry and all these other kinds of things. So that's the big story over the 20s and 30s, this transformation of robot as worker to robot as the machine that can save the worker.
And even in that time in general, we get this idea of technology and like the industrialization of the American kitchen, for example. And I have my electric stove, my electric washing, all this other kind of stuff. Like this is one lens for, what's happening in other sort of realms as well.
Yes.
With this mechanization. So that brings us to part 3 of your book, where you discuss how the robot became less of a metaphor for the present and more of a metaphor for the future, particularly in the context of the Cold War. And so how does this happen?
Yeah, so the best kind of way I can kind of describe this is to talk about robots' relationships with children. And like if you think about like iconic 1950s robots, so like Robbie the Robot is probably the best example from Forbidden Planet, but also The Invisible Boy and a whole host of other things. B9 from Lost in Space, like all of these robots that become so iconic in the period are associated with children and like become like the protectors and maybe even friends of children. This is also where you get like robotic toys that look like robots. So like people had like automaton dolls before, but they looked like dolls. They looked like people. Like now you have like Robert the Robot, which is the robot on the cover of my book, right? Which is, it looks like a robot. It looks like a machine, right? So you have this kind of rethinking of the relationship between children and robots that's going on. And before 19th century, early 20th century, robots had always been threats to kids. Like there's one story from the 1850s where robotically or magically enchanted automatons are supposed to come to life on Christmas morning and slaughter children in their beds. It's a horrifying story. There's like all these stories at the end of the 19th century where like robots throw kids against the wall because their parents turn over raising their children to robots, right? In the 30s, you have all these stories about how it's dangerous for kids to interact with robots. 1950s, that kind of concern goes away, and robots become the friends. They become the protectors of robots. They become like guided by things like Asimov's 3 laws of robotics, which don't allow robots to harm human beings. And so robots become literally these kind of protectors of the future, right? Instead of being this dangerous devices, they become literally symbols of how technology can be used to preserve both the American future and like the kind of like childlike innocence that Americans kind of wish they had in the Cold War. And so like even something like the Terminator, right? In the Terminator, Arnold Schwarzenegger is a terrifying, technically a cybernetic organism, but we'll call him a robot. It's just his skin that's humanoid.
I'm a cybernetic organism, living tissue over a metal endoskeleton.
But by Terminator 2, he's the protector. I mean, he's the cool guy in sunglasses, right? And so robots become this kind of protector and guarantor of the future, both in terms of like protecting the United States from external warfare, like automated defense systems, but also in terms of like consumer culture, right? They become toys that you can play with and kinds of things like that. And it's not to say that the horrifying, dangerous robot goes away in American culture, but by the 50s and 60s, there's this kind of new version of the robot as the friend and protector of children. And that's a really, I think, major transformation that goes on.
And so in the post-war era, the American robot in the form of the automaton has this dual nature of delivering ease and comfort. You talk a bit about Robot Santa. There's a few different forms of robotic Santas, including the not so nice one in Futurama, which you talk about as well. But also the way that it reinforced racial and gender hierarchies through technology. To go back to the Ohio auto plant that you had mentioned earlier as well. So what concerns did people have and how were they expressed culturally?
Yeah. So there's massive concerns about robots by the late 50s, early 1960s, particularly with the rise of workplace automation. It's something that really drives the New Left. It drives the labor movement in the period, particularly the UAW. It's a less talked about, but essential part of like the civil rights movement, because I mean, we have to note here that it's the kind of industrial automation is coming into factories at precisely the time that those jobs are opening up to non-white workers in ways they had never been before. And it's something that even guys like Martin Luther King Jr. writes about it, but a number of other people talk about it as well. And so there's these massive concerns about workplace automation that take place in the period. And I'll add to that, there's also concern from like the early revived feminist movement in the period. So like Betty Friedan is worried about home automation because she sees it as destroying the capacity of women to control their own labor. I mean, she starts her career as a labor journalist, right? And she's writing about its effects on women's labor in the home, right? To the extent that she sees it as a form of like de-skilling that goes on. So there are all these kind of concerns coming from different social movements of the 1960s and 70s about how automation is going to transform the nature of work in American society and really destroy the basic model of consumer capitalism that dominated in America in the 1950s and 60s, which is you work, you get a wage, and you buy things, and that keeps the cycle going. Well, if you get rid of jobs, that cycle breaks. We're kind of in another conversation about that right now, right, with AI. And so you have all these different kinds of concerns to it that end up getting really, I would say, erased within American culture in particular kinds of ways. And so like by the 1980s, the concern oftentimes promoted by the American media is that like Japan is going to use robots to take over the global economy, to displace the United States as the most dynamic economy in the world, to the extent that Japanese people themselves are often equated to robots, to the extent that the Japanese consulate literally put out a press release that said Japanese people are not robots. Like that's a paraphrase, but that's effectively what it says. I mean, think like domo origato, Mr. Roboto, kinds of things like that. Right. And so it because it's racialized and then of course gendered in particular kinds of ways, that allows those kind of fears about work to be displaced and put into it. So you have things like the Stepford Wives, you have other kinds of things that are using gender in particular kind of ways to talk about those issues as well. I do want to also say is that by the 1960s, you begin to get people challenging the kind of racist and misogynistic versions of robots. So like the Stepford Wives is part of that, right? But you also get things like the robot dance being created and spread, like guys like Michael Jackson, who are basically using it as a you think I'm a dancing machine, right? I'm going to show you how much better I am at this than you, right? And you have that kind of that's one of the changes that take place in the period, is that increasingly it is the robot becomes a symbol that is used to challenge dehumanization and do things like that. Like right now, one of my students is working on a paper and researching the ways that fan fiction in our present uses robots and androids to rethink neurodiversity and queerness in a modern era. So the robot doesn't lose, but it becomes also a vehicle for challenging racial, gender, sexual kind of stereotyping that exists. And you see this most probably with Janelle Monáe, but other figures as well. So I want to kind of be clear that there is that transition in the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century.
The problem's plain to see. Too much technology. Machines to save our lives. Machines dehumanize. The time has come at last. Secret, secret, I've got a secret. To throw away this last. Secret, secret, I've got a secret. Now everyone can see. Secret, secret, I've got a secret. My true identity.
So did you have a favorite robot going into writing this book? And do you have any new favorites now that you've finished it? My favorite robot is still Tom Servo, but I would love to see one of those chess-playing automatons. I'd like to teach Magic the Gathering to a chess-playing automaton from the 1800s.
That would be awesome. Tom Servo, I love Tom Servo. He's great. I like the funny robots. And I will say, to bring it back to Futurama, I started and I still really like Bender, the folk song singing robot from Futurama.
Froggy went to court and then he did right, Well, Froggy went to court and then he did right. Blah, 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 something Bender is great. Froggy went to court and then Bender is great, The
way Futurama has been able to kind of digest so much of not just like science fiction, but the kind of larger terrains of American popular culture and turn them into these things. I think it plays around with robots in really, really interesting ways. And yeah, I will probably always love Bender.
That's a good answer. I think they benefit more than probably much more than The Simpsons from having been on in the 1990s and then still making new episodes into the present, because they do get to engage with these topics, in technology and connect it to the past and the future in really fun, novel ways. But do you have any favorites that you discovered during this process that you would put on your, top 5, top 10 list?
I do think the automaton chess player is really fascinating. And, it's what I will say is that I wouldn't necessarily call them my favorites because so many of the robots I discovered and write about are problematic on a number of different levels. But like, I was really fascinated by the robot Adam Link from the 1930s. He's probably the most popular fictional robot in America before Isaac Asimov writes in the 1950s and 60s, or 40s and 50s. And he's a serialized robot who it starts out as this kind of Frankenstein story, but eventually about how people think he's a deranged monster who's going to come and kill them all, but it ends up It's a story about how he gains American citizenship, and it's a really weird set of stories, including one where he goes back in time to investigate a predecessor robot in ancient Norway, and it turns out that Thor is a robot, but in a weird time travel story, it turns out this robot was actually Thor. It's weird, but there's so many of these kind of like really like convoluted stories that are just like fascinating. And then of course, I do enjoy Asimov's robots like R. Daniel Olival, who's central to both his robot series and the Foundation series. And then of course, obviously Data from Star Trek is amazing, and I hope to one day write more about him. But
Absolutely. If you need a partner on that one, I'm all in. So you finished your book in 2019 and it was released in 2020. Things have happened since then. A number of things have happened since then. In the COVID era, we have seen a massive intensification in automation and mechanization of labor, as well as the rise, I hate to say the rise of AI, because the AI that we have is not necessarily AI, it's large language models, but I'll just say the rise of AI.
Yep.
Is this the start of a new era for the American robot?
Well, I mean that's the question, right? And it's one that is difficult to answer, especially for somebody who is a historian, because I like a little bit more time to digest eras first. But what I would say is that it certainly feels like it, and it feels like it because technology companies, marketers, the media want us to feel like it's a new era, right? I mean, AI is, as you kind of hinted at, AI is at this point basically a marketing term for it. It's like Web 2.0 in the early 2000s, right?
Or how 3 years ago everything was blockchain technology, just as sort of a way to keep a lot of these, tech companies afloat.
Yeah, it's not quite Zuckerberg's metaverse, but it's close to it, kind of thing like that in terms of marketing. But to me, what we're currently going through with like large language models and automation isn't so much a new thing as it is an intensification and acceleration of trends that have been going on for a very long time in the United States, become particularly prevalent since the 1980s. And I think one of the things that the kind of book suggests is that the robots themselves don't necessarily define the era. It's the larger context in which robots exist. And we still, to a very large extent, live in a context that is shaped by the conflicts of the 1960s, right? Conflicts. We live in an environment where, despite some signs in other directions coming from both Donald Trump and Biden, right? We still kind of live in a neoliberal kind of economic world. We still live in a kind of a postmodern kind of culture. And so I don't think we're actually in a new era. We're just being told that we are. And we need to kind of think carefully about that, because a lot of the conversations that we are engaging in right now have been conversations that have gone on repeatedly in American history, most particularly in the 1960s, and in the 1930s. And to really, I think, understand our current moment, it's important to understand what took place in those eras and how things could have gone differently, and other kind of options for how we deal with this, and to kind of realize that the issue isn't so much the technology, but of AI, the technology of all these other kind of technologies that I write about. It's the larger systems in which they are embedded. And we can keep changing the technologies, but unless we do something about the larger systems, they're still going to remain the kind of tools of injustice that I spend a lot of the book writing about. And so I guess my answer would be no, but we're not in a new era, but people want us to think we are.
All right, and of course we like to close out every episode with a book and film recommendation. Of course, the book this week to recommend is Dr. Dustin A. Abnet's The American Robot, A Cultural History. We just talked about it, but of course, there's so much more to it, and it's such a fun and enjoyable book to read. The thing I love about doing cultural history is that I feel like the books are all page turners, and this is certainly no exception. There's a lot of very cool sort of trends to follow, and you really get to see not just the progression of these ideas of labor and social hierarchy, but you get to see the progression of culture as well. And then for our film recommendations, we're going to do a TV recommendation. And Dr. Abnet, you recommend the series or the movie, but you're going to talk about the TV series Westworld. And so how do you use Westworld in your teaching?
So I'm a professor of American Studies, and so we are deeply kind of interested in in part in like the cultural myths and ideas that shape power relations within American society. And there are few shows that have come out over the last few years that I think more deeply combine the central kind of American mythologies than Westworld. And the reason for that, right, is it's the show about a Western themed amusement park, and think about how important Westerns are to American identity, American cultural myths. But it connects those to technology in ways that I think are really interesting. So it speaks to these kind of larger questions about technology and its roles within American national myths. But it also, and I would say from a historian standpoint, I also think it's a show about history and a show about thinking about how we think about the past. And as the robots continually forget their past and have to relearn it, kind of thing. And so if you can look kind of past the kind of plot machinations and things like that, I think it has a lot of really resonant meanings for scholars and students of American identity and American history to it.
Perfect. And then I will just add, for those of you who haven't, do watch Futurama. So
Yeah.
Dr. Abnet, I want to thank you very much for joining me today. I really enjoyed talking to you today, and I really enjoyed reading your book.
Thank you very much for the kind words and the opportunity to talk about robots.
The distant future, the distant future.
It is the distant future, the year 2000.
We are robots.
The world is very different ever since the robotic uprising of the mid-90s. There is no more unhappiness.
Affirmative.
We no longer say yes. Instead, we say affirmative.
Yes, affirmative.
Unless it's a more colloquial situation with a few robo-friends. There is only one kind of dance, the robot.
And the robo-boogie.
Oh yes, two kinds of dances.
Finally, robotic beings rule the world. The humans are dead. The humans are dead. We use poisonous gases, and we poison their asses. The humans are dead.
That's right, they are dead.
The humans are dead.
They look like they're dead.
It had to be done.
I'll just confirm that they're dead.
So that we could have fun.
Affirmative. I poked one, it was dead.